Hello, everyone. My name is Maximus. I'm here with Virtual Spectre and Moves Like Jagger from GG and Crew. This is Tome of Knowledge. Sorry, I was a little slow because I was making sure I didn't hit the wrong button this time. I was like,
You nailed it.
Okay, what button says Tome of Knowledge on it? That's the one that you want. I need to color code them. Purple button.
You can make separate profiles, and then you just load up that profile. And there's only the three buttons that you need.
Yeah, but I mean that seems hard because then I'll forget to switch the profile.
It is extra. It is an extra step.
Because I have everything I need. Yeah,
like,
on like two
TOK
screens.
on it, or
yeah, it
something
says
like
it says CNC TOK right on it.
oh,
I'm just
okay.
used to the muscle memory of like going, the next button over, which is not. So unfortunate.
Change
Except
the
for today.
icon to be you making a silly face, and then that's the one you need to hit.
Yeah, that's another good idea. Or I could actually include the icon of the show.
Oh,
That's
or
awesome.
the one
works.
One that Bun's redesigning.
Well, why are we here, Max?
Well, happy Labor Day, everybody.
Yes,
you had a
happy
good long
holidays.
weekend. This is our D&D show where we talk about whatever we want to talk about. And this week we're talking about dungeons. Half of Dungeons and Dragons, a major pillar, I would say, of the D&D experience.
Oh, yes.
Talking about designing dungeons. So, I have some thoughts. I know that you all have some thoughts. We talked a little bit before about some of this stuff. I think I just kind of want to like jump right in it and just kind of go. But I will say that the first things first, if you have never designed a dungeon before, or if you're still new to it, read Dungeon Master's Guide. Pick up the DMG and read it. Because there is a ton of stuff available. Random tables for environments. It talks about like the locations, like makes you think about who created the dungeon, like all kinds of stuff, like what the purpose of it was from people who built it, the history behind it. You can get into all that kind of stuff. And then it has a whole other section on like mapping out a dungeon, and it gives you a whole bunch of really great jumping off points. And then in the appendices, it also has like a random dungeon map creator where you roll on a table and it's like, okay, you go forward 30 feet or you turn right after 20 feet. And you can like randomly generate a dungeon with your dice if you wanted to. So first things first, if you're new, go read the Dungeon Master's Guide because it's very helpful. But I think most of these things could be read the PHB or read the DMG as the beginning of them. I feel like.
Yeah,
I already
and
learned
even if
something.
the adventure modules, they have a ton of already made maps and dungeons that you can already use. Which,
Yes,
which makes it expedite if you're not familiar. Just use the modules. They got them already. Boom.
they have the modules. Use graph paper, draw with like markers, like dry erase markers. There's literally like subreddits dedicated to like D&D and fantasy maps that you can just grab if you like something on there if you want to get fancy. But lots of like free resources out there, and the mapping and the layout is kind of one major component of it. I kind of want to go deeper into the meta of like what is a dungeon, right? What are dungeons for? Why do you introduce dungeons in a campaign? And to me, dungeons serve a couple different purposes. So kind of the first purpose is it presents a challenge to your players, right? It presents a challenge in which they are in a hostile environment. It's much more difficult to flee. It causes them to spend their resources. When you think of like a random encounter through the day, like most adventuring parties it's just an inconvenience, right? To them, they can mop that up, When you think of a dungeon, it's encounter after encounter after encounter, purpose built that way. So it's sort of a challenge to your players, usually in sort of an enclosed area where they can't easily, navigate through it. And I think that they can also serve as an important narrative tool as well. How to introduce things into your campaign that otherwise just wouldn't be out somewhere in the open, right? So it's kind of what I think like a dungeon is for. Or you can just have a dungeon just for loot, if you want. That's totally fine. But I think that's kind of why dungeons are now covered. Why dungeons?
It's in the name.
Yeah. Yep.
You're just playing dragons, and
You're doing it wrong.
I don't know.
Yeah, there's just like two major criteria for a campaign. I don't know, how do you view dungeons as players? Like when you hear like dungeon, like what do you think of? Like what do you think that they are?
Sometimes I hear or think about, all right, this is gonna be a dungeon crawl. I gotta conserve my resources, as long resting is gonna be extremely difficult. Is this gonna drag out? Is it gonna be fun? How many traps are there gonna be? Because I I think DMs probably are tired of hearing this, but like I check for traps for every single door, right? So I kind of also, as a player, like, oh, I got to make sure each door does not have a trap if I'm playing that type of character who can search for traps or whatever and disarm them. Or yeah, that basically loot, lots of loot, and probably a badass boss monster at the end of the dungeon.
Yeah. What about you, VS?
A lot of similar things to what Move said. One of them is, you know, how big is this place going to be?
Yeah.
Um, um, how many potential encounters are there going to be? Is this going to be a magic filled dungeon? Is it going to be not so much magic, but maybe just undead or some other crazy stuff? Like, what does my game plan have to be coming in here? Um, funny enough, I don't ever really think of loot or whatever or potential of loot when I find out we're in a dungeon or we're getting ready to step foot into some place. Um, it's always like, what danger's waiting for me,
Yeah.
and in what form, and do I have the things in my inventory I need to deal with it? Um, how's my health? Like, when was the last time we rested? I try to game plan all these things from the first room we're in, so I have an idea going forward. How far I might be able to make it, because sometimes it's gonna be harsh. Others are like 3 rooms and you solve a puzzle and you're done. You don't know until you get moving. So that's more
That's
where my head's at.
that's a
So
really great point because a dungeon doesn't have to be like a 15 room like mega dungeon crawl. It can be just a couple chambers with something in it. You don't have to go super extravagant just to have a dungeon. You touched on something else I want to bring up, but there's a very good question in the chat, which Village brought up. How do I prevent my players from sleeping in my dungeons? Um, it would be a very rare occurrence in which an adventuring party would be able to sleep in a dungeon, just by definition of what it is. Um, I'll give you some examples of things that I've come across. So if they do try to take a long rest in the middle of the dungeon, random encounters, right? Think about what the denizens of this dungeon would do if some people came into the dungeon and then tried to take a nap, right? They'd probably come after them. And then when they attempt to take their long rest, okay, cool. Then they get interrupted. And then they get woken up. I mean, continue ad nauseum all the encounters you plan for deeper in. I mean, once the bad guys hear the adventurers are trying to sleep, I mean, I know what I would do. Secondly, There was an instance in a game I played where the party we decided to leave to walk out of the dungeon because it was pretty brutal, and then to rest and then come back. And this was Jesse, who was on the show, who ran one of the one shots in between campaigns that we did. He basically was like, okay, sure, you can get out, you can take a long rest. When we came back, the enemies were prepared for us. They knew we were there. They had created barricades, they created traps, they knew all the entrances, they changed things. That's another way to do it. It's like, okay, if you want them to leave and come back, it's gonna be more difficult for them, right? If it only makes sense for the enemies that are in there, right? Is that okay? Wow, they're gone. Well, let's bolster our forces. Let's you know prepare better because we know they're going to come back, kind of thing. That's what I would do, um, to prevent the long rest, kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it also depends on what type of dungeon is it? Like, what are the creatures or enemies in there? Are they, eh, you said earlier, like, what's the reasoning for them to be there? Like, what part of the world are they in? Is there something at stake that they're doing in there that they might be fighting tooth and nail to be in there? Or is it a dungeon full of semi mindless zombies that's like an ancient tomb that's just been undiscovered or whatever? I think it depends. Like, there's certain ways I could see a party getting away with taking a long rest in a dungeon, but I think it would be up to how creative they are
Mm-hmm.
and how lenient the DM wants to be in that given scenario based on what types of enemies are there
Mm-hmm.
to allow it to happen. I can see if there's a chamber and the party can find stuff to barricade an entrance and then keep watch overnight, that could potentially,
Yeah,
or it might not work. Maybe there's no place like that that exists in the dungeon.
I think that is a good example of if your party wanted to take a short rest. That seems more viable. Barricade a room we just cleared, put the table in front of it, and let's take a breather before we continue on through there. But expecting
Yeah,
that to hold for a full night's rest, probably not.
yeah. I could see a lot of
Sometimes,
eventful watches with that one.
yeah, sometimes it's unavoidable because an encounter might have gone not as planned, and they end up using more resources than they wanted to.
Mhm.
I know this was probably all DMs hated this in 3.5 as the spell rope trick, and it lasted 8 hours. And you climb up a rope into an interdimensional pocket, you pull the rope up, and easy peasy because it was like an invisible pocket that no one could find. But if I mean the enemies knew you were there, they can wait for you to get out of the little dimensional hole. But uh, I I think they changed that in fifth
It's an
where it's only an
hour,
hour
so you can do
instead
a
of
short
eight
rest.
hours.
I like that
Um,
better. No
as a
resting in
player,
dungeons.
yeah, as a player, I didn't like it, but as a DM, it's definitely much better. That's just an hour.
Yeah.
Hmm.
All in all, it's gonna be really hard to long rest.
We
Also,
tried in campaign one, and yeah, a lot of shit came after us.
yeah, and keep in mind that you can only gain the benefit of a long rest once every 24 hours as well. So if they go in and fight one thing and then wait a whole day and then rest and then go in and then fight another thing and come out and then rest again, I mean, there's got to be some sort of sense of urgency of why they're doing that, or some elements would have to change in that dungeon to prevent video game cheesing it.
At least the
But
enemies don't respawn. Maybe.
Yeah, there's no quick saves in D&D.
no, there's not. Um, you mentioned something earlier, VS, talking about like the type of dungeon it is, and that's a really good segue into so purpose and theme like of your dungeon. And when I say purpose, I don't mean like what are dungeons for. I mean like what was this dungeon for now? Like kind of that's like the first sort of thing that I usually go into my head of okay, this is a dungeon. I need a dungeon for the campaign. Why did this exist? Why was this thing here? And what's the theme, right? And you touched on, is it like undead? Is it like a magic dungeon? Is it like a forgotten like ruins? Is it like, I mean, dungeons can be anything. Like, is it a haunted house? Like, go wild. Anything that can constrain the players into an area, you can make it into a dungeon.
Yeah.
Um, go for it.
Could be a
Tomb,
cave.
yeah.
Just a big old
Cave,
cave.
yeah. whatever your heart tells you. But I think that you do have to understand going into it what the purpose and the theme is that you're going to pick, because there needs to be some consistency throughout that to kind of help with the verisimilitude. There's a $5 word for you.
It's fine.
Yeah, I'm cheap. I'm cheap. For those of you who don't know what that means, it just means like giving the appearance that it's true or real. It's like buying into the fantasy, because some things can kind of pull you out of that fantasy. So making everything theme together and have a purpose and make sure it fits in the world goes a long way for that.
I'm sure we've probably covered this at some point, but as for you yourself, the DM, are there particular things that you tend to gravitate towards when making dungeons? Are there certain layouts or certain enemy types that doesn't matter where the dungeon is, that it's like your favorite little thing to add in, or do you have anything
I
like that?
always I'm trying to think of it, and I think that not a large percentage, but um a decent percentage. I always lean on ruins for some reason. That's kind of the theme that I usually seem to gravitate towards. And I'm not sure why. I think that in a lot of in the campaigns, picking ruins allows you some leeway into like injecting lore and like history and things to it. Whereas like a cave, you could still definitely do it. Um, but it might be, for me at least, a little harder to kind of do that. As far as like like favorite like enemies or anything or like stuff, I just try to I base it off the theme really of what I'm trying to tell. Like, you know, a dungeon that you all did recently. I won't go into super um detail for people those who haven't watched it yet for campaign 2. All of the enemies in that revolved around like magic and like the arcane, and that like sought after it, or like literally ate magic and like for breakfast. Like that kind of stuff. So they sort of have a reason to want to be there and why they're occupying these, forgotten ruins type thing. So that's kind of what I lean to.
It's definitely an interesting one. You guys should watch it.
It was pretty gnarly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you if you wanted to go into the details of how you built that dungeon, but yeah, if people haven't seen the episode yet, might be a little too spoilery.
Um, you all going into the reasoning of why that exists would give away spoilers to you all too that you haven't necessarily discussed as a group or uncovered. So, assuming there's still some inter party discussions that may happen or may occur based on some things that you may have found or some things that you may have seen in there. So
I guess we probably could talk about in a broad sense, like layout. We mentioned like there could be intricate dungeons with like 10 rooms and all of this crazy stuff, or it could be 3 chambers and a puzzle. This was not an overly like complex place, but the encounters inside and the stuff that our party was presented with made it a much more intense encounter than it otherwise could have been, given what the layout was. Because it really wasn't a complex place, but there was a lot of crazy stuff going on,
Yeah,
and
it was like
it was
it
yeah,
was the in between. It wasn't the rooms themselves, but like the vibe of the overall
yeah,
dungeon.
I think
the
there's
sort of
only like 5
narrative that
rooms
was
I
yeah
can
Yeah.
think of like total.
yeah the sort of narrative that was building through the place
Yeah.
was really
And
cool.
there's and I'll say too, based on kind of how we do the show and kind of how I choose to do like maps and stuff, I'm a little limited myself on what I can do. Like and I could spend the time and make up my own dungeon like from scratch, but more often than not, I'll take rooms that fit together and theme them together and sort of like put them together. Um, there's stuff where I've toyed with where I wanted to basically give you all a mega map and let you go through it. So it just takes more time for me to do. But yeah, I mean, your dungeon doesn't have to be a million rooms. I think that one took like the whole episode really to do. or 2, I guess, 2 episodes.
Yeah.
To get through.
It's funny you say you're like not fixated, but you tend to use ruins for your dungeons. And I'm thinking about myself. What I've done is I like to go with crypts or tombs.
Yeah, also very good.
And then this is for anyone designing any type of dungeon or scenery for that matter. If you have a waterfall, make sure there's treasure behind it. I just
Make sure
it's a
something's behind it
yeah,
because
it's
they're
a
gonna
game
look.
trope. It's a game trope, but everyone is always 100% gonna look behind a waterfall, and I do it in every single game I play. And when there's nothing there, I'm very disappointed.
There should be
I'm
something there. Doesn't have to
That's
be
what I was gonna
treasure.
say. I like how
Yeah,
Max
yeah,
put it. There has to be something there.
something. Yeah, doesn't have to be treasure. But yeah,
Mhm. Yeah. And I think like for those at home, like for mapping and like the layout of the dungeon, like literally, if you're thinking of it from scratch and you want to kind of do it on your own, like get a piece of paper and like map it out yourself. Like, get like a pencil and just like a piece of paper and just say, okay, here's where the entrance is. Here's a room. It looks kind of like this, and just doodle it. Like it doesn't have to be like good, just to get an idea of like how the layout you want it to be. It's also good to think in like 3 dimensions, right? Because it's going to add more to your dungeon if you add like staircases, if you add like slopes that go down, if you add multi tiers and stuff like that. It makes it more interesting uh, to the players for sure. Adding like different like random features. Maybe that in this cave there's like a 10-foot wide like opening, and I'm self-conscious because I don't know how to say this word anymore because I said it wrong. Chasm. I think in the past I said chasm, and that's not the right way to use that
Chasm,
word,
yeah.
but chasm.
chasm.
Yeah, but chasm, yeah. But like, why is this chasm there? Why is there a break in like the cave floor or whatever? Why is there a stream running through this crypt, like right through the middle of it? Like, just add these different features that add to the interest of the dungeon, because most of it is going to be like it's a crypt and it's got stone walls and the floor and that kind of stuff. So
I'm trying to
There, I,
recall. I'm trying to recall from our first campaign. You talk about doing a lot of ruins, but I feel like,
the mayor's mansion. Yeah,
yeah, I was
that
gonna
was
say,
that
I
was a
feel like
dungeon.
you do branch out and make some other, like I was gonna say that mansion that we went through. It was a whole big
Technically,
house that was like
it
an
was
abandoned
decrepit.
house. Yeah,
It was decrepit, so it was technically a ruin underneath. On top, it was
true. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
mhm.
yeah.
But it was one of those things where when going through it as a player, it was kind of like there was no reason to believe the house is haunted, but you almost traversed it as if it was. Like it was
Mhm.
abandoned. You didn't know what was there. You didn't know what was going to be when you opened a door. Um, so
It
I,
felt
Really, yeah.
it
And
felt
then
lived into though, but like because there's a kitchen, there's a living quarters, there's a servants' quarters, there's the washroom, there's the dining hall, there's you have to think of when you're building in a dungeon or an environment, like what pieces of what rooms are gonna be in there. Like, if it's a barracks, there's the sleeping quarters, there's the guardhouse, there's like all these things that you have to think about when you're putting something together. But if it's just like a
mhm.
cave and has a couple caverns, then you don't have to really go that deep.
Maybe they do.
unless
Well,
it's
you
a
could.
vertical
Well, you
cave,
could.
and then you got
Yeah.
Yeah,
some
you've all had some
caverns to drop
experiences
down.
there, some caverns to drop down. You've all had to do that too. But yeah, I mean, whatever the limits of your mind you can come up with. I'm very glad that I used and found that map because it was nice to give you like a big area with multi rooms. Just say, okay, you tell me where to go. So that was um the Lord's house in campaign 1, and
Justice.
also,
That's
and then
Ormsby. Yeah.
the other, well, there was 2, right?
Oh
There's
yeah, that's
the
right. That's
mansion
right.
and then the house too. So those were both good times. But yeah, definitely map out, get an idea, make multiple entrances and exits, multiple decision points. Try not to make it linear if you can get away with it. It's harder for me to do that on the show, in certain circumstances, but give them a map, cover up the areas they haven't been to yet and say, okay, go for it. Which way do you go? Um,
I am a big fan of hidden rooms or secret doors.
yes.
I've played a lot of Neverwinter Nights. I played a lot of D&D Online, the MMO, and sometimes in dungeons and rooms there's a hidden passage or room. I'm a big fan of those. So I like adding like not all the time, but like one in like specific places and areas that have my players going through.
Yeah. Another good point. The vampire manor that you all went through in campaign 1 had some
Yeah,
hidden secret rooms.
I think that speaks to like having things in your dungeon that rewards players for creative exploration.
Yes.
Like it could be them picking to check a room that's seemingly unimportant, but maybe in under a rug or in a dresser drawer there's a key to a door that they passed an hour ago and couldn't figure out how to get into. Or finding ways, well, not hand holding necessarily, but little ways to reward players for looking thoroughly throughout your dungeon, rolling well on perception checks, investigation checks, that sort of thing, to
Mhm.
have things that they get excited about finding. That means they can go to this room that they thought they could never get into previously,
Mhm.
or whatnot. That's always something that excites me. It's like you enter a room, DM says, Hayden or Valken, make a perception check. You do it, you roll well, and he's like, you see something shining, hanging from the wall just behind a picture frame. Go find a key or find a switch
Mhm.
or find something that reveals a secret bookshelf. Or those things are super fun for players, and it excites the party, especially if it's a long dungeon and you've been kind of like meandering from encounter to encounter. Finding a secret place is awesome.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
he was like, "Oh, treasure, because the secret room," or it could be something hilarious like a I don't wanna say it now. Like, it's a naughty room, you know?
yeah.
Just trying to think of
uh,
a way to say it politely.
so I think one thing also to remember is even though you're in a dungeon, still think of it in terms of encounters and not just combat. Yeah, more than likely there's probably going to be combat in a dungeon, but there's other things that you can do as well. Environmental hazards are a big thing. Like if you're in a
Mhm.
cave, is there going to be a cave in? All sorts of wacky things can happen. Um, Besides environmental like things happening, like hazards, traps are another great sort of encounter for players to deal with that sort of follow that theme of having them like use resources or think through a problem, like that kind of stuff. And there's plenty of guides for like trap making, or just take one, just take a trap that you find in the DMG or Xanathars and then just change stuff about it and then make it your trap.
Speaking
Yeah.
of traps,
Hmm.
how how when is it too many traps and when is it too little traps? How do you find a good balance where your party doesn't constantly, "I search for traps, I search for traps."
So if I were to run across a player that was constantly I search for traps like every 5 feet, I'm gonna be like, okay, we're gonna use your passive investigation from now on. And if your passive investigation catches something, then I'll just tell you because nobody wants to sit there and roll every 5 seconds, you know, to see if they can see something, kind of thing. That's what that's there. That's what they're for. The passives are there for, so that
Mm.
to keep you from having to do that over and over and over.
Yeah.
That's what I would do anyway.
And you can also set sort of an expectation based on like what type of dungeon it is. Is it the secret lair of an old wizard? Well, maybe it's going to be trap heavy. Is it, I don't know, somebody's house? Probably not, unless you think
Depends on
they're a
whose house.
shiesty. Yeah, unless you
Yeah,
think they're a
yeah.
shiesty person or something. But
Yeah,
if it's like the farmer John's house or whatever, yeah, maybe there's not going to be so many traps. So I
or
think,
a
Yeah.
Temple of Doom situation. Yeah.
yeah.
Rolling boulders, classic. I mean, good question, Frog 50. I'm drawing a map right now. Favorite trap types. Um, I like how Xanathar's breaks it up into like simple and complex traps, right? Um, I like throwing like the more complex traps at players that force them to explore like different skills that might necessarily be unusual for solving traps. Like, you know, they have to pass, a perception roll to see it, an investigation roll to figure out how the mechanism works, maybe an arcana to figure out that it's being magically powered, or like an athletics roll to like jam like a hand axe into the mechanism to keep it from working. Like I like to add lots of different things into it to give either like multiple avenues for them to solve it, but also to make different skills kind of matter. I like doing that. um, but I will say, like, you definitely don't want to include a bunch of complex traps in your dungeon because they take more brain power to run. They usually have things that occur on different initiatives as well throughout the entire like initiative round. So it can be a lot, and they're usually pretty deadly. But I like throwing that kind of stuff at players. There was a trap um that I came up with, and this was back when they were doing like D&D was doing like the DM like competition thing as like an entry for it. So I was like, well, whatever. I made my own trap, and I'm not gonna go too much into detail for it, so in case I want to reuse it and then put that at y'all. But this one was it was I'll dance around it, but it was very well themed in sort of around a particular like god in the realm, and it was like they had found like a forgotten sanctuary, and the trap involved a lot of different cool stuff. So definitely theme your traps too, make them fit into the dungeon that you're having them crawl through. I think that works as a roundabout answer for you, Frog 50. Let me know if you got anything useful out of that. But
I like the classic pitfall trap. Um because of the I want to say it, because of the experience it creates. So like if someone falls into a pit trap, it would some depending on the TM would allow their allies to make a save check to see if they grab onto the person, and if they fail, they get so kind of domino effect
mhm.
can happen if a bunch of series of unfortunate rolls of the party trying to save one person ends up being like I don't know, human centipede of trying to pull someone out of the trap. I'm saying a lot of weird things today. What's your favorite
Uh,
trap, VS?
I think I'm partial to sort of magic traps where like party steps into a chamber, the statue on the wall's eyes glow, firebolt comes out. Because it could be one of those things where it's party doesn't exactly know what triggers it. Is it just that it saw you? Is it something you stepped on the floor?
Mhm.
And then also now you have to make a dex save, or try and take half damage, or I don't know. There's just for something so simple as that, there's a number of things that could play out because then the party has to stop and be like, well, what is making this trap work? Or the party can be like, I'm gonna break that statue, and then it's not a problem anymore. Like there's a number of things that can happen, and so those simple little magic-y things where you're gonna force a party to stop and think or get hurt. It's I think they're fun.
Is it bad that when you were like, and they break the statue, and then my mind immediately was like, oh, if they break the statue, then toxic gas gets released into the room because
Sure,
that's not the way to do.
you can
It's
layer. You can
possible.
layer
Yeah,
it.
yeah, that make it more complex. But yeah,
I think you touched on this before, Max. As even though you have one trap or the way you're designing your dungeon, having multiple ways or options for your
hmm,
players to handle said encounter or trap,
yeah.
like multiple ways of success. Like it's not just like straightforward or linear. There's things they can do to circumvent the trap.
Yeah, and I think we could really talk a full episode just about traps. But one thing that I do with almost all of my encounters is I know the characters that they're playing well enough. It's very rare for nobody to have anything to help in a particular situation. Now I don't like hand cater every single like encounter to a specific player or something like that. But generally, you want to make sure like, is this doable? Like, do they have the tools they need to succeed here? Because you definitely don't want to throw like no win situations at your party too often. Like every once in a while, it's okay to have them kind of overcome adversity and triumph, but it's too often, then it just feels awful.
Yep, yep.
But yeah, traps, puzzles are great too to throw in there. I mean, social encounters in a dungeon, it could be viable. They run across an adventurer who was left there from the previous party, like, or they have to talk to a statue and answer some riddles. Like it could be like, whatever you want, right? I as a player, I don't like puzzles. If I'm in a dungeon and a puzzle's happening, I'll let the puzzle solvers figure it out because that's not me. I don't like to puzzle. But as a DM, I like to include them because I know that some people like to do that. Uh, Namely, I think Bun also likes puzzles, so she's
Yes.
a puzzler. But yeah, for sure.
Let's talk about what goes in dungeons, like monster density. How many are there mini bosses? Is it the main boss? Like, how do you go about planning how many encounters you want your players to go through?
I think that when you're planning your encounters, this is the time to follow the DMG/player handbook of 6 to 8 encounters per day, like in per
Oh God,
adventuring day. Um,
no.
and yeah, that's the dungeon is the perfect avenue for that. And when I say encounter, it doesn't mean you're doing 6 to 8 combats in a row, right? Dungeons might take multiple sessions. Feel free to like spread your legs out, stretch them out. An encounter could be a puzzle, it could be a trap, it could be an environmental hazard they have to get across. The rope bridge is broken, they have to figure that out. That's an encounter. They have to, get past, the ancient spirit who's guarding the door and has to answer some riddle. Like that's an encounter. Doesn't mean you're fighting 6 to 8, combat encounters in dungeon. But I think that like the density, especially in a dungeon, I don't want to say like put combat in every room, but there should be something interesting or unique that they could interact with in almost every room, depending on the size and what it's there for. There should be otherwise then why is there a room? Just to have a room, you don't really want that. Each sort of room should have something, whether they can learn something they have to overcome, or like enemies to defeat, or maybe it's something that they need for later on in the dungeon is in this room. That kind of stuff. That's kind of how I think of it. Is the purpose of each room as it serves like for the game. I don't know. What do you all think for like density of things in dungeons as you're going through them?
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, what your purpose of this dungeon is for. If it is a dungeon crawl where you're spending multiple sessions in, and the goal objective is to, yeah, fight a bunch of monsters and get a bunch of cool loot, then that's okay. Um, yeah, I guess, yeah, it does. If you're placing a room, it does make sense to have something to be there to make it worthwhile for the player. Like, oh, it's just an empty room. Sometimes that happens. Like, it's just a bathroom. There's nothing special in there, you know. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't remember where I'm going with this, but yes, yeah. What's up?
Um, as a player, I like when things are happening, obviously. Um, so if the dungeon, if we go for like an hour and we're not really like coming across anything cool, obviously that's a little boring. But luckily we have a good DM and that doesn't happen. But I don't know. I'm in between. I like combat. Combat's fun, but I also enjoy a little bit of puzzle solving here and there. Um, uh, I enjoy things that make me dig into my character sheet and look and see what my features are, or look in my inventory to see if I have something weird that could be used. I, so encounters like that. So as long as something's happening where I feel engaged, or I can sit back and let the other players in my party do their thing and just enjoy them and their characters doing stuff, then I'm a happy player.
Mhm. Good question, Village. So the dungeon that locks people in, another popular trope, to keep your players from leaving and resting. um, how do you handle a player character dying really early on? So, thinking from my perspective and kind of how I design things, if a player character dies very early in a dungeon, um, probably one of two things happened. One, they were incredibly unlucky in their dice rolls, or two, they were incredibly stupid in something that they tried to do. Right? They did something incredibly stupid that kind of got them there. And in those scenarios, like there's nothing that you can do. Um, and we've talked about this before, how like a player character death should be heavy and have meaning, and you should definitely let the party kind of figure that out, and kind of let the characters mourn for their lost, you know, um, party member. But I mean, if they die and the party has no way to bring them back, I mean, then it's like, all right, put your player, your character sheet away, and you and me will talk next time about what your new character is going to be. Like that's really all you can't do. Like there's there's not going to be a Deus Ex Machina type situation. Maybe that gives the players incentive to try how to get through the dungeon quicker, or maybe it rallies the party, and well, we have to finish it for our fallen hero Steve, who went down in room 2. Let's do it for
Oh,
Steve, that kind of
yeah.
stuff.
Or they're like, oh, cool, more loot for us.
But yeah, I mean, if it happens, you just deal with it the same way you would otherwise. If the dungeon's locked and there's a mechanic that they have to do to get out, you don't want to, in my opinion, you don't want to like hand wave that away, because then there's no more purpose of the dungeon. And then now the players realize that you're making it easy on them because a character just went down, and you don't want them to have that feeling like that you're taking it easy on them because something happened. Because then it feels like that their choices don't have meaning anymore if the DM can just make it easy now because something happened. So, in my opinion,
Yeah, I think it's really up to the DM how to handle that situation as well. Do do the players, after the dungeon's over, find a cleric that can resurrect, or something like that? Uh, I know in some cases, back in the day, if someone died, they would just roll a new character basically for that session while the rest of us played.
yeah, that's what I would suggest. Because you got to think is like, yeah, they try and find a cleric unless they have very powerful friends. Like those are very high level like spells. Hope they have revivify.
Yep.
Because I think that kind of breaks the immersion of like, oh, they go to the nearest chapel, and the cleric says, oh, okay, they've been dead for a day and a half. Yeah, I'll bring them back, no problem. Like, I don't know if that would fly for me. That's resurrection's like what, 7, 8 levels. It's up there.
Yeah, that's a good question, Village. I don't know. I'm not sure if someone in our party has revivify or not.
Well, no, I mean not at this point. It's a 3rd level spell. You do have
Yeah.
a party member that has spare the dying cantrip, but no. Good question though. Player death's always a touchy subject, or player character death is always a touchy subject. Correct myself there.
Yeah, I have a handful of stories I could just go on about how things got out of hand on finding enough money to resurrect a party member.
I think too, some of the things that you can think about of like going, like, because going through a dungeon is supposed to be hard and like taxing and trying. Like, should reward your players for making it through that. What I will usually do is I'll roll on like a treasure hoard table and spread that stuff out and figure out what they get and that kind of stuff, because it should be rewarding. You know, they get the thing and then they get some loot and some other stuff, because um the journey is not the friends you made along, you know, along the way when
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
going through a
I mean,
dungeon there.
most chances the dungeon is going to progress the main story or whatever the quest they're on as well. So
Yeah.
they get some sort of resolution, whether it be loot, progressing the story, or character development, and
Hmm.
or any of those things.
Yeah. Yep. For sure. For sure. And I think kind of a final thought aside, like the narrative integration is important, that I wanted to touch on, are add some dynamic elements to your dungeon if you can, depending on what you have. If it's like some weird magic dungeon, make the room switch around, you know, every so often, make things happen, create a sense of urgency. Do those little things, the same things that you do for combat and for encounters, to go with the dungeon. You know, maybe they have to get the thing before it floods with water, right? Or the dungeon's going to collapse, or something's going to happen. Add those things in, to kind of help with that intention and sort of with the dungeon. Or like wandering monsters, right? They're talking in a room and like figuring out what they're gonna do next, and then there's a monster right in the doorway. It's attacking them, like that kind of stuff. Make it more dynamic is a good thing.
Which you've done, by the way, the room filling with water slowly. When we're campaign 1, when we were fighting those hags.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, almost had a character die.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I forgot
and
about that.
Bryn almost died. Yeah,
That is the closest I've ever had a character die too. It was about one roll away. So fun times.
Yeah, that was a rough one.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there'll be plenty of other times. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Bring it
yeah. Well, I
on.
mean, are you? It can happen. You never know.
Yeah, I mean, you never know. But yeah, I hope that you learned something in our little talk about dungeons and their design and stuff like that. I think to kind of recap of, if you're starting to create a dungeon, figure out like the concept, the theme, the purpose, figure out the layout, map it out, come up with encounters and like challenges in it, um, fill in the details and like the environmental storytelling portion of it, figure out the rewards and like the loot aspect of it, put some dynamic elements in it, and then weave your story into it. And if you do all of those things, sounds like a lot, but if you just do them step by step, do all those things, then you'll have a good dungeon. It'll make sense. So, but there's plenty of tools to help you. There's plenty of dungeons already created if you don't want to even bother with it. Um, or even if you do, even if you find a map, still make it your own. Add all the extra narrative, seasoning on top of it. Make it your own thing. Anything y'all think? Did I miss anything? Anything you want to bring up before we come to a close?
I think we did a fairly good job of covering it.
Yeah, and if you have questions, comments, and want more info, just leave it in Discord, tweet at us, YouTube comments, all that stuff. Yeah, and then let us know if you want Max to make his own maps.
I mean, it's possible. I have software to
Yeah,
do that, but it's like a once in a while thing that I want to make special. Not every week. I got to make a dungeon because I'll go insane.
it's a lot of work. It is a lot
Unless
of
you
work,
want grid
yeah.
paper.
Hey, grid paper works. That's how I map out my dungeons. A little grid paper,
Yeah.
draw them a little tiny. Boom.
Yeah, that's for sure. One final question. Dungeons tend to be buildings or cave, but how do you make something out of a forest or a swamp or whatever? Anything that can be used to limit the players in that particular area. For a swamp, maybe there's a magic fog that's around, a particular like a forest, a magic forest. There's a fog all around it. They can't navigate through, and they'll get lost. And if they pass through it, then they find themselves in a different part of the dungeon. For a swamp, maybe it's a poison, or there's dangerous creatures that lurk, outside of this particular area. Just use your imagination. Yeah, just
Yeah, very
Yeah.
low. Overgrown thickets, felled trees, all those things.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, the trees part in a certain way to make enough for you to pass through.
Mhm.
Caves, of course, also help out. Little caverns along the way. Even though you said
Yeah.
they tend to be buildings or caves, but you know, it happen.
Hedge maze, classic. Um,
There you go.
make him get a thing that's at the top of a plateau or a mesa, and then that's your area. The top of the plateau or the mesa, they have to get the thing. It's in there. Whatever's up there. Anyway, just some other ideas and last questions. But thanks so much for watching and or listening. If you're in the future, much appreciated. Check out on Tuesdays 7 p.m. Bunny Dreadful on the channel doing her art streams, and then Thursdays our Out of Combat drops on our YouTube channel and podcast only, and then Fridays 6 p.m. Come watch us live stream our second campaign. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Night.